Hi, everybody, and welcome to Storms on the Way. I'm Alistair Stevens, and tonight, in the 19th session of our discussion of American Gods and our first truly post-season 1 discussion of American Gods, we delve into Chapter 12. We go backstage in the Dakotas, which is a fascinating passage in the book. We return to Lakeside, and Shadow is momentarily reunited with Laura. It is a pleasure to have you all here with me this evening. It's good to have you all here in the YouTube chat. You can, of course, ask questions and contribute to the discussion as we move forward here via the YouTube chat or via Twitter using the hashtag StormsOTW. You can also access the Point North Media Patreon exclusive Discord channel for Storms on the Way, which I can also keep track of as we're moving forward in our discussion this evening. Before we get to it, though, a couple of quick announcements. The first is that this coming Thursday, I guess in almost exactly 48 hours from now, I'm holding a genre class all about mystery fiction. Registration will be open until tomorrow night, and there are still spaces available. So if you would like to learn how mysteries work, how they are constructed, how to better appreciate them as a reader, this isn't just a class for writers, though it will be primarily focused on writers. But if you are a passionate mystery reader, you'll also get something from this class too. You can check out Lies and Locked Doors, How and Why to Write Mystery Fiction, currently available over on pointnorthmedia.com. Secondly, there are some new updates to the Point North Media Patreon page. It's still a work in progress. There's still a little work to be done, but there are a number of new milestones there, mostly relating to improving the broadcast quality that I have here at Point North. So if you would like to pledge your support to support independent critique, analysis, and discussion on the internet, which I think we're all agreed is a pretty valuable thing. And if you have $1 or so a month that you can pledge to the cause, then head on over to patreon.com/pointnorthmedia to do exactly that. Thirdly, and lastly, I am looking into, as part of improving our broadcast platform here at Point North Media, I'm looking into switching away from YouTube to another broadcast platform that will give me more tools and more flexibility. I'm investigating a couple of options, but if you have personal experience of using the broadcast platform Crowdcast, particularly in a professional capacity, please get in touch and let me know what you thought. You can email pointnorthmedia@gmail.com, which is also conveniently the email address that you can use to get in touch about tonight's session and to let me know what you thought of Chapter 12. We've got Becca here, and Aaron, and Kate, and Gildarts Winters is here, and Kim is here. The whole crew is here, you guys, and we are ready to go. Before we get to Chapter 12, though, we have a little unfinished business to which we must attend. We have our Coming to America from the end of Chapter 11. The story of Mama Juju in 1778. This is, I think, maybe for me personally, the least successful of the Coming to America stories that we get in the book. It feels as though it takes a very long time. And while there are interesting complexities to be unraveled from this passage in the book, it doesn't feel necessarily as though it completely earns its weight. Not least of all because, well, the connection between Haitian voodoo and ultimately New Orleans voodoo and the events within the pages of American Gods are somewhat flimsy, somewhat thin, somewhat insubstantial. So while there are obvious thematic echoes here, and while of course the Coming to America stories impart a great sense of time and place in the course of the novel, this one to me doesn't necessarily feel as functional, as purposeful, as direct, and as applicable as some of the others that we get in the book. That is not to say that it is completely devoid of purpose, though I do have, I guess, 4 slides looking at the short passage. So I guess there's some stuff in there at least. Let me take a look. Yeah, Becca says here in the YouTube chat, this Coming to America is weird. So glad it wasn't just me. Felt a little rambling and I wasn't sure I was supposed to be understanding. I'm not sure that I understand the point. If there is a greater point, if there is a greater applicability of the story of Mama Juju to what happens in the rest of the book, then I confess I'm missing it. The minor points of applicability I absolutely get. Rage and anger and death and life, of course. And in addition, always, always the story of gods being imbued with belief by those who need it the most. But I'm not sure that there's a core thematic point that we can pick out. Though who knows, perhaps we'll discover it in the course of the next 10 minutes of discussion. Let's begin with our first slide and one of our classic Mr. Ibis introductions. There was a girl, and her uncle sold her, wrote Mr. Ibis in his perfect copperplate handwriting. That is the tale. The rest is detail. There are stories that are true, in which each individual's tale is unique and tragic, and the worst of the tragedy is that we've heard it before, and we cannot allow ourselves to feel it too deeply. We build a shell around it like an oyster dealing with a painful particle of grit, coating it with smooth pearl layers in order to cope. This is how we walk and talk and function, day in, day out, immune to others' pain and loss. If it were to touch us, it would cripple us or make saints of us. But for the most part, it does not touch us. We cannot allow it to. This is fascinating, not least of all because it gives us another example of Ibis's luminous prose through the pen of Neil Gaiman, of course. But it also provides a fascinating contrast with what would seem to be one of the underlying purposes of the Coming to America passages in the frame of the book, which is to communicate exactly that personal and human experience. When we have the story of Essie Tregowan, for example, we are deeply and profoundly connected to her, a person, well, who is not entirely free of problematic morals. Essie Tregowan is not a saint. She is not possessed of unparalleled virtue. She is, though, a survivor. And our personal connection to her, the emergence of empathy, the call to feel empathy for Essie, is a powerful part of our understanding of the Coming to America of the Cornish Piskies. That is, of course, all the more powerful in the TV show when that story is reframed to very clever and wry purpose. But here, Ibis begins by telling us that this is not a story with which we can easily, emotionally connect. The huge vulnerability of these twins who are separated, the huge vulnerability of these characters who spend their life in bloodshed and oppression, and of course, I mean, not to put too fine a point on it, but actual slavery, that this emotional burden threatens to be too great for the reader. So we coat it. So we prettify it. The making of the oyster's pearl around this fleck of grit. And I wonder to what degree this is emblematic of the novel as a whole. I wonder to what degree Gaiman is suggesting that this is where gods come from, not from our desire to mythopoeically explain away thunder and lightning and the rainfall and the harvest, though that is certainly one purpose of the myth, but also to distance ourselves from genuine human suffering, from genuine human hurt. This presents to me an interesting perspective on the conflict, the unfolding and infinite conflict between men and gods in the pages of American Gods. Why do we need gods? Why do we turn to them to explain the world, to give us hope, to give us a sense of purpose, a sense of place, a sense of justice, certainly, powerfully, a sense of identity, but also sometimes it would seem from this short passage to explain away the world, to actually distance ourselves from others. It's a heartbreaking introduction to a story that, as I say, unfortunately doesn't quite pop as vibrantly as some of the others. Aaron says in the YouTube chat here, this one didn't have the polish of the others, seemed forced to fit into New Orleans history, which it does in a couple of really interesting ways. That's a good observation. And Becca says, that is the tale, the rest is detail, might be my favorite sentence in the English language. Though, of course, that's fundamentally untrue, because the tale itself is not the girl being sold by her uncle. I mean, it is in part, that is our inciting incident, but the inciting incident is only ever the first step along the road to narrative. The story itself is possessed of a greater shape, is possessed, in theory, at least in the finest examples, of a greater purpose. So while it is true that the detail is, in a sense, incidental, that the detail doesn't matter, the core is this truth, this ugly and difficult and tragic truth, the detail does provide a great deal of insight, a great deal of complexity, and it is from the detail that we gain our understanding of these characters. It is from the detail that our empathy is roused, if indeed our empathy is roused. And empathy is, of course, how we connect with characters. This has turned to utterly devastating effect for me personally right at the end of tonight's reading, when Shadow is momentarily, tragically reunited with Laura in Lakeside. This is such a beautiful, poignant, vulnerable, human scene, and absolutely rests upon its detail. The story of Laura Moon is that she cheated on her husband and then kind of died. But that's not what's important. What's important is the mess and the tangle and the thrust of difficult and complex and contradictory human emotions. That's a great scene. We're going to get to that in due course. We should, though, move through our story. Basically, the story is split in half. We get, on the one hand, the story of the brother, whose name has now completely escaped me because inexplicably I didn't write it down. Agasu is the name of the brother. I did write it down. It's all fine, you guys. Don't worry. I've prepared copious notes. So we get, first of all, the story of Agasu, who is caught up in the Haitian slave revolt, the Haitian rebellion, sometimes known, perhaps a little less accurately and a little less, politically, as the Haitian massacre. Here we get a perspective on the gods who demand sacrifice and what we are willing to do in the names of the gods. And this is not new for us in American Gods. This is not a particularly fresh or necessary take on worship, except in the degree that it is contrasted with his sister's worship, which we'll get to in just a moment. But it is, of course, beautifully written. Here's our slide. If we die in battle with the whites, they told each other, we will be reborn in Africa, in our homes, in our own tribes. There was another Hyacinth in the uprising, so they now called Agasu by the name of Big One Arm. He fought. He worshipped. He sacrificed. He planned. He saw his friends and his lovers killed, and he kept fighting. They fought for 12 years, a maddening, bloody struggle with the plantation owners, with the troops brought over from France. They fought and they kept fighting, and impossibly, they won. On January the 1st, 1804, the independence of Saint-Domingue, I'm not sure how to pronounce that. I just realized that I have insufficient French to properly pronounce that. The independence of Saint-Domingue, soon to be known to the world as the Republic of Haiti, was declared. Big One Arm did not live to see it. He had died in August of 1802, bayoneted by a French soldier. At the precise moment of his death, at the precise moment of the death of Big One Arm, who had been called Hyacinth and before that Inky Jack, and who was forever in his heart Agasu, his sister, whom he had known as Bututu, who had been called Mary on her first plantation in the Carolinas, and Daisy when she had become a house slave, and Suki when she was sold to the Levere family down the river in New Orleans, felt the cold bayonet slide between her ribs and started to scream and weep uncontrollably. So we have this vital and necessary and urgent connection between Bututu and her twin Agasu, who are, as we see here, sold into slavery, marched from Nigeria to the African coast. They are taken across the sea in a Dutch slave ship, which is a nice, I guess not echo, but which is nicely echoed in our introduction to Mr. Nancy in the TV show. Then they are separated, and more than separated, they are dehumanized. They are literally dehumanized in the broadest sense, in that they are rendered slaves, they are rendered possessions and property and objects, but in a more subtle and individual way, they are dehumanized by the taking of their names. Their names are replaced. Their names no longer belong to them, though crucially, the death of Big One Arm, as we see here on the slide, who had once been called Hyacinth, and before that Inky Jack, and who was forever in his heart Agasu, who was forever in his heart. That core identity was never taken from him. And when we talk about core identity in the frame of American Gods, we oftentimes connect that to worship. We connect it to that tribal identity that we gain from worshiping those gods who are worshipped by our people. This is fundamental. This is absolutely primal. The break in the narrative here is fascinating because there is something approaching, I think, a Saint-Domingue, says Becca Eller, which is wonderful. Thank you so much for correcting my pronunciation there. That's lovely. I appreciate that very much. Yes. The break of the narrative here is fascinating because this is a point where we get the intrusion of a political awareness, a political presence. And what bothers me the most, I think, is that this does not feel to me like Mr. Ibis. This does not feel to me consistent with his very human and personal accounts, those accounts which we witnessed previously. On January the 1st, 1804, the independence of Saint-Domingue, soon to be known to the world as the Republic of Haiti, was declared. Great, they won. This is a great story, except Big One Arm did not live to see it. He had died on August 1802. So 18 months before, bayoneted by a French soldier. We don't even get the details of his death. We don't get his climax. We don't get the inevitable fire into which he fell. What we get instead is this death turned to purpose. We get this death used as a means of connecting back to Watutu. That's powerful, but I feel as though in the hands of a different narrator, if this were just a part of the book and not explicitly in the voice of Mr. Ibis, it would sit more comfortably with me, because this is the kind of thing that Neil Gaiman, the author, does all the time, and does so very well. This is not to say that this is not a strong narrative technique. It just doesn't feel to me like a narrative technique that we would ascribe to Ibis. So that is the first half of our story, I guess. More importantly, though, for the purposes of this fiction, we then move to New Orleans and we catch up with Watutu, who is now called Suki, now that she is in New Orleans, and we see her effectively turning to worship in a way that is explicitly transactive. She is not turning to worship for power. In that sense, she's not turning to worship for cultural identity even. She is turning to worship, I think, for personal identity. She is certainly defining herself in terms of her worship. This is where we get her name, the name that she chooses, Mama Juju. That's an important transition for her. But it's a very different kind of faith. For all of his, well, I don't want to say failure. I mean, ultimately he did succeed, but for all of his dedication, Agasu seems to be a fervent believer. He absolutely believes in this narrative. He is touched by the gods and is something of a prophet. He leads and fights and struggles and continues to fight. And even though he falls, even though he sacrifices, even though he is martyred in this cause, he is successful. Watutu never takes up that cause. She never fights in the name of something other than herself, at least, which is completely understandable. I mean, given the life that she's faced. Let me put it this way. Essie Tregowan also didn't fight for a cause. Essie Tregowan also found a personal connection with the gods and with the spirits of her personal belief system. And we don't condemn her for that. So I certainly want to be clear and distinct here that this is not in any way a condemnation of Watutu. What I think is most fascinating is simply that these twins went in the two possible directions that one can go. We can serve the gods through our faith, through our worship, through our sacrifice, or we can call upon the gods to serve us. And that gives us a very different inflection. Let's look at the next slide here. This is the point by which Mama Juju is approaching the teaching of the widow Paris. Let me share this with you. She does not want to know, complained Mama Juju to Clementine, her confidante, who took in the washing for many of the houses in that district, washing their curtains and coverlets. Clementine had a blossom of burns on her cheek, and one of her children had been scalded to death when a copper overturned. Then do not teach her, says Clementine. I teach her, but she does not see what is available. All she sees is what she can do with it. I give her diamonds, but she cares only for pretty glass. I give her a demi-bouteille of the best claret, and she drinks river water. I give her quail, and she wishes to eat only rat. Then why do you persist? Asks Clementine. Mama Juju shrugs her thin shoulders, causing her withered arm to shake. She cannot answer. She could say that she teaches because she is grateful to be alive, and she is. She has seen too many die. She could say that she dreams that one day the slaves will rise as they rose and were defeated in Laplace, but she knows in her heart that without the gods of Africa, they will never overcome their white captors, will never return to their homelands. So Mama Juju doesn't answer. She could say that she teaches because she's grateful to be alive, and that's true. She could say that she dreams that one day the slaves will rise, and that's true of a sort, but she knows in her heart that without the gods of Africa, they will never overcome their white captors. But the teaching here, the communication of faith and worship and knowledge and belief, crucially always belief, would kindle the presence of the African gods here in America. Now, she doesn't perhaps know that theologically, she doesn't perhaps know that cosmologically, but it is true nonetheless. And here again, we see the ways in which gods are bound, not just by the stories we tell about them, but the stories that we tell about us. Mama Juju has a narrative now. She understands to a degree her role in the world. She has a place and she has a personal identity and a name that she has forged for herself, forged in rank adversity. But what she doesn't have is true faith. What she doesn't have is true belief. Here we get the echoing of the rituals and the spells of belief, but not actual legitimate worship. So this is our beat with Madame Paris here. With the widow Paris, I should say. Worship them, Mama Juju told the young widow Paris in the bayou 1 hour after midnight. They were both naked to the waist, sweating in the humid night, their skins given accents by the white moonlight. Jacques, whose own death 3 years later would have several remarkable features, had told Marie a little about the gods of Saint-Domingue, but she did not care. Power came from the rituals, not from the gods. Together, Mama Juju and the widow Paris crooned and stamped and keened in the swamp. They were singing in the black snakes, the free women of color and the slave woman with the withered arm. There is more to it than just you prosper, your enemies fail, said Madame Juju. Many of the words of the ceremonies, words she knew once, words her brother had also known, these words had fled from her memory. She told pretty Marie Laveau that the words did not matter, only the tunes and the beats, and there, singing and tapping in the black snakes in the swamp, she had an odd vision. She sees the beats of the songs, the Kalinda beat, the Bambula beat, all the rhythms of equatorial Africa spreading slowly across this midnight land until the whole country shivers and swings to the beats of the old gods whose realms, she had left. And even that she understands somehow in the swamp, even that will not be enough. The widow Paris, this I think is partly what Aaron was referring to earlier when he mentioned the historical context here of New Orleans. The widow Paris, real name Marie Laveau, as you see here, was a freeborn woman who married a refugee from the Haitian revolt described in this story. So the fact that she is the widow Paris, or will be the widow Paris, is a direct consequence of the Haitian revolt. She was a real-life voodoo practitioner in New Orleans. It is said that as many as 20,000 people went to Lake Pontchartrain in June of 1874 to witness her voodoo rites and rituals. She is considered one of the most important voodoo queens, one of the founders of New Orleans voodoo. She died in 1881 and is buried in New Orleans, where, interestingly, and this is just historical note, I suppose, interestingly, members of the punk band The Misfits were arrested in 1982 for allegedly trying to exhume her body. Those punk kids, you guys, those punk kids. So what are we seeing here? Well, we're getting, in a sense, the truth. She's getting a perspective on the future here. And as she recognizes, it will not be enough. Because the truth is that from New Orleans, from Louisiana, from Mississippi, from Georgia and the Carolinas, Black music, African music, did spread across this entire land. It did make the entire land move. It gave us blues originally, jazz, rock and roll, all modern music with, I guess, very few exceptions. Most modern American music, those pieces of music, those genres of music, those styles of music with which we associate this country are at least inflected by, if not outright descended from, the music of African slaves that came into this country in the 16th and 17th centuries. That's true. That's part of the vision that Mama Juju has. But of course, this tide of music, this tide of drumbeat that flows out across the country wasn't a tide of conquest. It was a tide of acclamation. It was cultural association by this point. It was hybridization, crucially. So these drum beats, these rhythms, this vital essence that beats within Mama Juju does, as she suspects here, spread out across the land, but not in the way that she wants. Crucially, too, we see another perspective here on the coming of gods, the emergence of gods, the investment of belief. We're told here that Mama Juju has forgotten the words to many of these ceremonies, that she doesn't know them, but she invents them. And because her belief is strong, because her belief is, in some sense at least, primal, if not in a cultural way, then at least in a personal way, enough. It doesn't matter if you know the words. What matters is the words with belief. That is what prayer is. You don't have to conform within the frame of American gods. You don't have to conform to a particular structure or to a particular orthodoxy. If you pray and you believe, then that's enough. You will create the gods. And that's obviously very powerful. Aaron says, yes, if you know one voodoo practitioner name, it's Marie Laveau. Yes, good, good. Becca says, I like that you can feel the beat through the words while she's explaining. Again, though, we get this. This feels like another breakaway from Mr. Ibis. I don't feel that Mr. Ibis writes like this. I feel that Neil Gaiman writes like this. We've talked about this repeatedly through the first half of the book. She sees the beats of the songs, the kalimba beat, the bambula beat, all the rhythms of equatorial Africa, spreading slowly across this midnight land until the whole country shivers and swings to the beats of the old gods whose realms she had left. That kind of tumbling, riotous sentence structure doesn't, to me, feel quite like Mr. Ibis, which I think is one of the reasons that I'm less engaged by this story than in some of the others. So that basically concludes our thoughts on Mama Juju. The change of faith is an important one. The construction of faith is an important one. We see here the opposition between a kind of fervent and primal faith and then a much more cultured and much more self-conscious, self-aware, self-reflexive kind of faith. I think that it's important that Mama Juju, by the end of her life, is in part worshiping for her, whereas that was never true of Agasu, that he was worshiping in a, well, I was going to say worshiping in a truer way, but that's not actually technically true. He was worshiping in a different way. He was worshiping in a way that was not about him as opposed to his sister. That's a key distinction, but it gives us, I think, at best, simply another perspective on this idea that as gods rule man, so gods are ruled by man, which we'll certainly revisit in the course of chapter 12, which we are going to move into right now. Let me see here. Maybe Neil Gaiman wrote it and Ibis dictated, says Becca Eller. I like that a lot. That's pretty good. That's pretty good. All right. So let's move into chapter 12. We begin with Wednesday retrieving Shadow from Lakeside and the two driving out to South Dakota, visiting a Native American reservation. On the way, Shadow takes a moment to tell Wednesday about the girl who is missing from Lakeside, Allison McGovern. It was midday on the second day of the drive, and they were almost there. Shadow, who had been thinking, said, "A girl vanished from Lakeside last week when we were in San Francisco." Mm-hmm. Wednesday sounded barely interested. Kid named Allison McGovern. She's not the first kid to vanish there. There have been others. They go in the wintertime. Wednesday furrowed his brow. It's a tragedy, is it not? The little faces on the milk cartons, though. I can't remember the last time I saw a kid on a milk carton. And on the walls of freeway rest areas. Have you seen me? They ask. A deeply existential question at the best of times. Have you seen me? Pull off at the next exit. Shadow thought he heard a helicopter pass overhead, but the clouds were too low to see anything. Why did you pick Lakeside? Asked Shadow. I told you. It's a nice quiet place to hide you away. You're off the board there, under the radar. Why? Because that's the way it is. Now hang a left, said Wednesday. Wednesday, in his classic style, ducking the question here. It is, of course, a tragedy that people go missing, but the tragedy is not, as Wednesday suggests, the little faces on milk cartons. The tragedy is not the walls of freeway rest areas. The tragedy is certainly not, have you seen me? The tragedy is more real and more human than that. And Gildarts Winters here in the YouTube chat is applying absolutely appropriate capital letters here. Have you seen me? Have you known me? Have you experienced me? To see someone, in the sense that Wednesday is suggesting here, the deeply existential sense of this question, is not about interaction. It is not even necessarily experiential. It is much more profound than that. To be seen is to be recognized, is to be understood, is to be perceived more than simply another person in the world. To be seen is to be identified as something that is uniquely you. And that is enormously powerful. And that is possibly something which Allison didn't have. We have this brief flicker at the end of chapter 11 of dissatisfaction in Lakeside. And we talked about the ways in which Lakeside's story is so powerful that it sweeps up even Shadow Moon. Even this guy who has no reason, really, to be swept up by this story, falls into it almost immediately. Lakeside's story is so powerful that it dominates, that it overshadows the the stories of those who live within this community. And that's not to suggest that there is anything nefarious happening in Lakeside. I think this is simply true of places that have a strong identity. It can be true of anything that you use as an identifier of community and shared culture. It can be true of faith. It can be true of religion. It can be true of political allegiance. It could be true of your favorite sports team. It can be true of the bar that you go to or the people that you associate with. Sometimes our identities, in the way that our identities are externalized, sometimes those externalized elements can overshadow the truth. We should use these things as landmarks by which to delineate the dimensionality of who we are, but sometimes we use them as substitutes. And that may well be something that is happening here. And by Wednesday's inference, something that is perhaps not completely unknown in American popular culture. As Aaron says, also, Wednesday clearly knows and doesn't care in the slightest. This is pure skill by Gaiman, presenting that without tipping his hand. Yes. Well, and Becca calls out, this is beautiful, Becca. Yes. Are there posters like that in the Museum of Forgotten Gods? What a lovely idea. That's not at all dissimilar, is it? This freeway rest stop papered with, have you seen this god? I mean, we've talked about the ways in which, of course, that is the quiet tragedy of gods and all supernatural beings in the realm of American gods is that is impossible. Gods cannot be remembered. They cannot be mourned. They cannot be grieved, because if they are remembered enough to grieve or to be grieved over, then they wouldn't have died in the first place. So that is the intangible tragedy of godhood in American gods. But yes, I do like that very much. There is a direct association there. Good. Good. All right. So from there, we learn that Wednesday detects some trouble. We get a little early foreshadowing of that in that previous slide about the helicopter passing overhead. Something is going wrong. Something is problematic, and Wednesday decides to take action. He inscribes runic inscriptions on the dashboard, and we get this lovely beat where Shadow likens them to hobo code, to the little glyphs that would be inscribed on door jambs and fence posts about the contents of the house which the hobo was visiting. And of course, those of us who are taking both of the major Point North seminar discussion series right now may well think back to the beginning of The Hobbit and Gandalf inscribing a little runic G on Bilbo's door too. Sometimes these inscriptions matter a great deal, but he carves out this runic inscription and then they pass, well, they pass backstage, whatever that may mean. This is as they're leaving the car, and Shadow is unperturbed. Wednesday looked at him with amusement and something else. Irritation, perhaps, or pride. "Why don't you argue?" asked Wednesday. "Why don't you exclaim that it's all impossible? Why the hell do you just do what I say and take it all so fucking calmly?" "Because you're not paying me to ask questions," said Shadow. And then he said, realizing the truth as the words came out of his mouth, "Anyway, nothing's really surprised me since Laura. Since she came back from the dead. Since I learned she was screwing Robbie. That one hurt. Everything else just sits on the surface. Where are we going now?" Wednesday pointed, and they began to walk. The ground beneath their feet was rock of some kind, slick and volcanic, occasionally glassy. The air was chilly, but not winter cold. They sidestepped their way awkwardly down a hill. There was a rough path, and they followed it. Shadow looked down to the bottom of the hill and realized that what he was looking at was impossible. We'll get to what Shadow is looking at in just a moment. But first of all, we have to draw a connection all the way back to the house on the rock, because it seems very likely this blazing starlit sky, this black almost silhouette of a landscape, this feels somewhat similar to the depictions that we had in the house on the rock after Shadow transitions for the first time into the realm of gods. We're going to keep track of this quote-unquote backstage area, of this adjacent other world. We'll definitely keep track of that as we move through the book. It's going to be marginally but powerfully significant later. Yes, good. Gildart says Harry Potter was in a hut on a rock. That's true. There's the Harry Potter Wisconsin Tourism Board crossover that we wanted. That's what it is. They just need to rename the house on the rock, the hut on the rock. And then I guess every time tourists are coming around, just have Robbie Coltrane as Hagrid burst in and tell you that you're a wizard. Yes. Aaron says, "I need a doormat with that glyph of Gandalf's." I just kind of want it on my door, honestly. I just want that there. And then any passing dwarves will know that this is a good place for adventure, which, believe me, it would be. My most important question here doesn't stem from Wednesday's irritation or pride, this little ambiguous note with which he confronts Shadow right here at the beginning of the slide, but rather with the response. "Because you're not paying me to ask questions," said Shadow. Then he said, realizing the truth as the words came out of his mouth, "Anyway, nothing's really surprised me since Laura." Why does Shadow choose to say this now? Why is he saying this? Because it's not true. Firstly, Shadow has been constantly surprised in the course of the book up to this point. Shadow has been damn near overwhelmed more than once. So it's absolutely not the case that Shadow is now, thanks to the adulterous affair that his wife had with Robbie, Shadow is now immune to surprise and to shock. That's explicitly untrue. So what does it mean? What is it that he's talking about? Well, anyway, nothing's really surprised me since Laura. Wednesday asks, since she came back from the dead. Shadow replies, since I learned she was screwing Robbie, that one hurt. Everything else just sits on the surface. So Shadow's not talking about confusion. He's not talking about surprise. Nothing's really surprised me since Laura, he says. And when Wednesday questions him, he says, well, Laura hurt me. Everything else is just set dressing, I suppose. If this is the backstage area, then the world is the set. It is the onstage set. And those are two very different ideas, because we do not have to be hurt by something to be surprised by it, and we are not necessarily hurt by things which surprise us. But Shadow is conflating these two things. Why is he right now in this emotional space? And I guess the question that I'm asking, and I read this sequence again today very carefully, trying to get a better sense of Shadow, trying to get a better sense of his interiority, which is, of course, as distant as ever. I mean, Shadow exposes his interiority, but okay, the metaphor I would use is this. Shadow's interiority is like the North Atlantic. There are icebergs of revelation and exposition there. Occasionally, we get these powerful accounts. No, this is a thing that Shadow is feeling. But the rest of the time, it is the trackless, bottomless ocean. And we've no way of monitoring what's going on in there. And here we're given no real icebergs, because in particular, I don't know that I necessarily believe what Shadow is saying in the here and now of the story. Is Shadow influenced by being backstage? Or is he thinking of other things? We'll get to those at the end of the chapter. Shadow tumbles down the slope. We get, of course, I will mention the mechanical spider here, the weird technical spider with the glowing LEDs and the pile of bones. He plummets down, and we get this account. He put a hand down to push himself to his feet and found himself touching what appeared to be a thigh bone with the palm of his hand, and he was standing in the daylight, smoking a cigarette and looking at his watch. There were cars all around him, some empty, some not. He was wishing he'd not had that last cup of coffee, for he dearly needed a piss, and it was starting to become uncomfortable. One of the local law enforcement people came over to him, a big man with frost in his walrus mustache. He'd already forgotten the man's name. I don't know how we could have lost him, says local law enforcement, apologetic and puzzled. It was an optical illusion, he replies. You get them in freak weather conditions. The mist. It was a mirage. They were driving down some other road. We thought they were on this one. This is our introduction to Shadow's sudden experience as Mr. Town. It's powerful, it's immediate, it's unlike anything else that we've had in the course of the book. And it's striking. I should say also that Kate is asking, anyone else feel like Alistair is plunging further into darkness after each slide? You know, I absolutely am. I'm going to do an unprecedented thing and actually get away from my microphone for like a half a second to turn on the light, which I neglected to do when I sat down to record this podcast, because let me tell you, when I sat down to record, this room was bathed in light. So rather than disappear into darkness, as appropriate as that is thematically for this chapter of American Gods, I'm going to turn on a light. There we are, much better. When I come back, you will be able to see me. There it is. So this transition is sudden and forceful. It does give us a better sense of Mr. Town and of the spooks in general. They're kind of surprisingly mundane and physical, anchored existence. This, I think, is why Gaiman emphasizes Town's need to piss throughout this entire passage. He's a flesh and blood human being with flesh and blood concerns, and those are driving him at this moment. But we also get our introduction to the voice here of Mr. World. And Shadow is surprised that Mr. World sounds familiar. I'm not going to go too deeply into Mr. World because really we have nothing about which we might speculate. We'll return to Mr. World next week in next week's reading. Let's move on then to the next slide as Shadow asks where we are. When the metallic spider was only a distant glint in the starlight far back in the plain, Wednesday said, "Should be safe to speak now. Where are we?" "Behind the scenes," said Wednesday. "Sorry?" "Think of it as being behind the scenes, like in a theater or something. I just pulled us out of the audience and now we're walking about backstage. It's a shortcut. When I touched that bone, I was in the mind of a guy named Town. He's with that spook show. He hates us." "Yes. He's got a boss named Mr. World. He reminds me of someone, but I don't know who. I was looking into Town's head, or maybe I was in his head. I'm not certain." "Do they know where we're headed?" "I think they're calling off the hunt right now. They didn't want to follow us to the reservation." "Are we going to a reservation?" "Maybe." Wednesday leaned on his staff for a moment, then continued to walk. "What was that spider thing?" "A pattern manifestation. A search engine." So I guess we can refine our metaphor here. If this is backstage, the real world is perhaps not the stage, but is in fact the audience, or at least human beings are the audience. I pulled us out of the audience. Now we're walking about backstage. It's a shortcut, though, as we learn, it is a shortcut that doesn't entirely come without a price. So here we're aligning ourselves with Wednesday and, of course, with Shadow, and we're drawing lines that will become immediately apparent. I said that next week, we're going to look at chapter 13, and that is true. But between chapter 12 and 13, we get the interludes. We get 3 quick glimpses of events in the world of American Gods, and those glimpses are explicitly intended to highlight the beginning of the war. We are on the brink of all-out hostility right now between the new gods and the old. That is going to reach its, well, I was going to say reach its peak. In a sense, it is going to reach its peak next week. Certainly, it's going to be at its most immediate and surprising next week. But even here, we can feel this darkness. We can feel this shadow across the landscape. We can feel this dangerous heartbeat pulse across America in a way that is not entirely dissimilar from the drumbeat vision of Mama Juju. Good. I wonder how horrifying the stagehands in Backstage would be, says Aaron. Yeah, pretty horrifying. Most are horrifying. Yes, and we're already looking ahead to Sam next week. We get, I think, my favorite scene with Sam next week. I can't wait for that. All right. So that is where we are with the... Oh, no, I guess I have one more slide. Before we leave behind Backstage, I wanted to call this out. Wednesday reached into an inside pocket and produced a small hip flask. "Take a sip of this," he said. "Only a sip." The liquid was pungent and it evaporated in his mouth like a good brandy, though it did not taste like alcohol. Wednesday took the flask away and pocketed it. "It's not good for the audience to find themselves walking about backstage. That's why you're feeling sick. We need to hurry to get you out of here." They walked faster. Wednesday at a solid trudge, Shadow stumbling from time to time, but feeling better for the drink, which left his mouth tasting of orange peel, of rosemary oil, and peppermint, and cloves. My speculation here, and the reason that I called this out, and the only reason that it is really worthy of discussion, is that it struck me very powerfully that this is obviously Soma. That this indescribable taste, this indescribable liquor that Wednesday gives to Shadow at this point can only be Soma. It can only be the distillation of belief and prayer into physical form. This is what Wednesday was talking about previously. And I think that it makes a great deal of sense that someone who is pulled from the mortal realm backstage into the realm of gods, are we comfortable referring to it as the realm of gods? It doesn't seem to be any more theirs than the real world in some ways. I guess less theirs than the real world. Though, things. The sci-fi spider is clearly one of them. Is that actually a metaphorical representation of a real world search engine? Possibly. It certainly could be. And we're also getting these accounts of Wednesday as we march across this glassy volcanic plain, that he has his hat and his cloak and his staff. He is now no longer dressed like Wednesday. He is dressed like Odin. He has taken on, apparently subconsciously, more of the form that is true to him and true to his mythic self than to his more mundane self. So it seems as though the rules here are less fixed, and certainly magic is more important, and magic and belief within the frame of American gods, those things are basically interchangeable. So it seems absolutely appropriate to me that shadow could be sustained by soma as we walk. Rosemary, peppermint, cloves, that doesn't seem appetizing. No, I love this. This is, you're absolutely right. Aaron says this in the YouTube chat. Oh, and Kate says, this reminds me of chocolate and Dementors. This is lovely. And Gildarts is wondering, ambrosia? It could be ambrosia, but we have no sense of ambrosia really within American gods. Soma is the specific reference, and I love this. Try to imagine, just for a second, what this tastes like. Orange peel, rosemary oil, peppermint, and cloves. I mean, I can't get there. I can't imagine what that is. And I think that what Gaiman does here is to very quietly suggest things which seem mundane. And if you gloss that, then it won't stand out to you. But if you sit and you think about what that taste would be, it doesn't seem possible. I can't envision it. I am very, very tempted, let me tell you, to go and mix up some kind of soma cocktail. I need like the talented bartenders in the audience to get in touch and suggest a means of mixing a cocktail that will combine all of these things and taste good. I'm really not sure that there's a way of doing it, you guys, but I'm up for the challenge. So get in touch and let me know. But yes. Oh, Kate says my first thought of the mechanical spider was Madam Web. Wow, that is some serious 90s Spider-Man reading. Yes. Good. All right. Let's keep going on, because we have to get to the actual purpose of our visit to the Dakotas. Here we go. We learn here that that Wednesday was in fact planning a visit to a reservation because he had hoped to make contact with at least one god and finds himself with two. Wednesday seemed delighted. Well, he said, it seems our delay was fortuitous. Whiskey Jack and Apple Johnny, two birds with one stone. The man at the table, Apple Johnny, stared at Wednesday. Then he reached down a hand to his crotch, cupped it, and said, wrong again. I just checked and I got both my stones, just where they ought to be. He looked up at Shadow, raised his hand, palm out. I'm John Chapman. You don't mind anything your boss says about me, he's an asshole. Always was an asshole. Always going to be an asshole. Some people is just assholes, and that's an end of it. Mike Ainsel, said Shadow. Chapman rubbed his stubbly chin. Ainsel, he said, that's not a name, but it'll do at a pinch. What do they call you? Shadow. So, a little recap here, because these are relatively obscure characters. Less obscure, perhaps, in part to an American audience, but pretty obscure to me, let me tell you. John Chapman here is Johnny Appleseed. Born in 1774, died in 1845, renowned for two things. Firstly, walking the length of this land, planting apple tree nurseries, and also being an itinerant missionary for the Swedenborgian New Church. Unlike many of the gods presented in the pages of this novel, there's no question over whether or not John Chapman was real. He absolutely was. His myth is an example less of a deity myth than it is a folk hero archetype, rather than the kind of stories that we see told about Wednesday or Astera or Nancy, for example. His missionary work, by the way, is almost certainly the reason that the priest who is mentioned later in the chapter is somewhat downhearted and distrustful of Chapman. That's just a nice little theology joke there by Neil Gaiman. We should say, too, that Whiskey Jack, more properly Whiskey Jack, is a primarily Algonquin trickster god. It's not quite accurate, but it's also not so inaccurate that we should spend more time on it. We can basically think of Whiskey Jack as something akin to a Native American Loki. He certainly has all the hallmarks of the trickster god. Oh, good. Oh, Gildarts Winter says, after the whole asshole thing, I heard Mike's surname as asshole. That's so weird. Very good. Oh, and Kate says, I wasn't thinking of Johnny Appleseed. Yes, no, it took me a little bit to dig into this too. And I should say, I guess, while we've got a moment, that we also reference throughout this chapter Paul Bunyan, who I will go into because A, it's relevant, and B, he is even less familiar to me and perhaps less familiar to non-American readers than Johnny Appleseed. Paul Bunyan is a mythic figure, a giant lumberjack of a man, often accompanied by a blue ox, who apparently emerged from the oral traditions of North American loggers, but his actual story was codified by William Lochhead in 1916 in a pamphlet intended to promote the Red River Lumber Company. Basically, he took what was, at least in a fragmentary form, an oral tradition, a local fairy tale, and turned it into an actual story, the story of Paul Bunyan. And in this way, he too is distinct from most of the other characters that we've seen in American Gods. Paul Bunyan was, if not created outright, and there is a little controversy over the degree to which there ever was an oral tradition of Paul Bunyan stories prior to this pamphlet for the Red River Lumber Company. But if he wasn't created outright, and he may have been, he was at least defined as part of a conscious, deliberate, mythopoeic exercise, as part of a commercial enterprise intended to excite interest in a lumber company. We created a god because we can do that. We start telling tales about folk heroes, and that's what happens. So the tension between Paul Bunyan, and the reason that I think Paul Bunyan is described as empty calories later, the reason that Paul Bunyan is just, he's a placeholder of a mythic figure, is that Paul Bunyan doesn't really have any substance. Johnny Appleseed doesn't really have any substance either, not the kind of substance that we would attribute to, well, gosh, literally any other god that we meet in the pages of American Gods, I would say. But Johnny Appleseed does at least have a kind of mythic quality, this itinerant wanderer who spreads the gospel and good word, but also in whose wake apple trees spring up. I mean, that's a pretty good kind of classic god archetype, even if it's cast here in more, as I said, the folk hero archetype. So this is what we're doing. What is fascinating here in this entire section is that we are primarily concerned with gods who are not newcomers. There is no coming to America story for Whiskey Jack. There is no coming to America story for Johnny Appleseed. There is no coming to America story for Paul Bunyan, except for that initial pamphlet, I suppose. These are actual American gods. And the way that they interact with Wednesday suggests, and even more specifically, I think even more acutely, the way that they interact with Shadow suggests that they may not be playing the same game on the same board as either the old gods or the new. Certainly we get this sense when John Chapman introduces himself. Your boss is an asshole, always been an asshole, always going to be an asshole. That's it. That's the truth of Wednesday, and is not, completely inaccurate. Let's move on to the next slide, because I want to look at I want to look at Shadow telling about his dreams here. Gildarts Winters says, gods and folk heroes are different things, right? Yes. But oftentimes it's only a case, a case of magnitude. It is certainly true that certain folk heroes could ascend to a kind of demigod status, but what is distinct about the folk hero is that the folk hero was a real person. That's okay. I'm going to be very careful here. The folk hero was a real person, or was thought to be a real person. The lines between mortals and deities, men and gods, are, depending on your culture, more or less fluid, but usually someone who is born mortal doesn't get to become a real bona fide god. There's oftentimes provision made for demigod status in different cultures, but usually those two things are distinct. Your gods are torn from the womb of titans, or are carved out of living rock right at the first moment of creation, or just simply have always been. I am that I am. These are gods. Folk heroes are generally, there was a guy who lived out in Missouri who used to do these things, and tales are told and legends spread and myths arise, but they're always anchored in, no, but he was a real guy who did this thing. I suppose Johnny Appleseed kind of fits that form really rather beautifully. That's an almost perfect encapsulation of that. So hopefully that's enough to clarify the distinction. Let me see here. Oh yeah, we're trying to fix the flavors. No, this is terrible. Aaron says, grenadine and London Dry, a splash of Fireball whiskey poured over an orange peel with a sprig of rosemary for scent. That does sound really bad. That does sound really, really bad. I may just have to try a few of these. That's just going to work. Let's do it. Elizabeth is here because the 2-year-old still isn't asleep, but I quit and got a bowl of ice cream, and hi. Sometimes you just have to quit and get a bowl of ice cream. That's it. All right, let's move to our slide with Whiskey Jack asking Shadow about his dream. Tell me your dream, said Whiskey Jack. Shadow said, I was climbing a tower of skulls. There were huge birds flying around it. They had lightning in their wings. They were attacking me. The tower fell. Everybody dreams, said Wednesday. Can we hit the road? Not everybody dreams of the Wakinyao, the Thunderbirds, said Whiskey Jack. We felt the echoes of it here. I told you, said Wednesday. Jesus. There's a clutch of Thunderbirds in West Virginia, said Chapman idly. A couple of hens and an old cockbird, at least. There's also a breeding pair in the land. They used to call it the state of Franklin, but old Ben never got his state up between Kentucky and Tennessee. Of course, there was never a great number of them, even at the best of times. Whiskey Jack reached out a hand the color of the red clay, and he touched Shadow's face gently. His irises were light brown, banded with dark brown, and in that face, those eyes seemed luminous. Yeah, he said, it's true. If you hunt the Thunderbird, you could bring your woman back, but she belongs to the wolf in the dead places, not walking the land. So here we're pushing back against Wednesday. And what is much more important, Wednesday is the intruder. Wednesday is the interloper. This is not his land. Chapman has the knowledge of America, talking about the state of Franklin, talking about the Thunderbirds in West Virginia, talking about America. Belongs to it in a way that Wednesday doesn't. And it belongs to him in a way that it doesn't to Wednesday. And then, of course, Whiskey Jack reaching out a hand the color of the red clay. The connection between Whiskey Jack and the land could not be more powerful, could not be more explicit, and honestly is only going to get more so. So here we learn that hunting the Thunderbird, this casual reference that Wednesday gave to Shadow a couple of chapters ago and said, hey, look, it's nothing to me if you go hunting Thunderbirds and Eaglestones. Well, actually, that wasn't a throwaway reference. Actually, there is something of substance there. Whiskey Jack confirms it's true. If you hunt the Thunderbird, you could bring your woman back, but she belongs to the wolf in the dead places, not walking the land. And there again, that connection with the land, that connection with this place. And we're moving here toward a conclusion that is drawn very subtly and then becomes kind of suddenly explicit at the end of the book. And it may, to some readers, feel as though I'm anticipating that movement, but certainly by this point, through Shadow's connection with Whiskey Jack here, his connection with Chapman here, his connection with the landscape as they are literally traveling across the United States, and most importantly, most primally, his series of dreams, being birthed from the land itself, seeing the star people, climbing the Tower of Bones, the Tower of Skulls, and of course, the Buffalo God. There is a tension here, under the surface, but rising fast, between actual American gods and those gods who now call America home. We have reached the point now that we have actual American gods, or at least an original indigenous American god, and also an American god who is rooted specifically to the soil of the United States. Now that we have these characters, we are given enough leverage, we're given enough perspective to start to move that side of the story, to start to crack open that shell and peer inside. So that's where we are. Yeah, the Soma cocktail is going to be real bad, you guys. There's just no way to salvage this. I'm terribly sorry. Yeah, pretty bad. We then leave and we return and we get an exchange here. We get an exchange here between Wednesday and Shadow when we learn that Backstage is not all that it seems to be. Happy Valentine's Day. So we set out January the, 20th, 21st? I wasn't keeping track of the dates, but it was the third week of January. We were 3 days on the road, all told. So how is it the 14th of February? Because we walked for almost a month, said Wednesday, in the Badlands, backstage. Hell of a shortcut, said Shadow. Wednesday pushed the paper away. Fucking Johnny Appleseed always going on about Paul Bunyan. In real life, Chapman owned 14 apple orchards. He farmed thousands of acres. Yeah, he kept pace with the Western frontier, but there's not a story out there about him with a word of truth in it, save that he went a little crazy once. But it doesn't matter. Like the newspapers used to say, if the truth isn't big enough, you print the legend. This country needs its legends. And even the legends don't believe it anymore. But you see it. I'm a has-been. Who the fuck cares about me? Shadow said softly, "You're a god." Wednesday looked at him sharply. He seemed to be about to say something, and then he slumped back in his seat and looked down at the menu and said, "So, it's a good thing to be a god," said Shadow. "Is it?" asked Wednesday. And this time it was Shadow who looked away. If the truth isn't big enough, you print the legend. This country needs its legends. If our understanding of the world is insufficient, make our understanding of the world bigger. Inflate it until it matches the grandeur of our experience, the complexity and the contradiction of our experience. If we don't know, then start telling stories, because sooner or later, the story will expand to fill the space of knowledge. It will expand to encompass the actual fact of the thing, and will, in a world as fluid as American Gods, change the nature of that thing. This is why we tell stories, and this, critically, crucially, is why we have gods. What's most important, though, is this moment of, well, what? Self-awareness from Wednesday? I'm a has-been. Who the fuck cares about me? Shadow said softly, "You're a god." Wednesday looked at him sharply. He seemed to be about to say something, then he slumped back in his seat and looked down at the menu and said, "So?" This is perhaps the least Wednesday moment that we've seen from Wednesday to date. This is certainly his least fiery moment. This is his least true and purposeful and Odin-like moment. He is more, I think it's fair to argue, Wednesday here than he is Grimnir, than he is the Allfather, than he is One Eye. This is a human moment from a man who has just encountered, well, the truth. This, to me, reads as a moment of understanding from Wednesday, and I don't think for a moment that it's an understanding that is unfamiliar to him. I don't think this is revelation. I think this is just reminder. He has been forced to confront once again the fact that this is not where he belongs, that this is not his home. And there is a sense in which Paul Bunyan, this empty calorie styrofoam box of a legend, is more true to this place than Odin is. And this, I think, is why there is the tension between Johnny Appleseed and Whiskey Jack and Wednesday throughout that entire sequence. But also, specifically, this sense of Wednesday being displaced, being unrooted. He has been the master of his domain. Think about last chapter when he's talking with Easter, when he's talking with Ostara, and he is absolutely dominant. And Easter is a much more powerful god, even in her current form, than Johnny Appleseed will ever be, and certainly than Whiskey Jack is now. So there he was confident, there he was purposeful, because he was in his domain. He was among other immigrants, and the immigrant story of American Gods remains vital. It's easy to overlook because we forget, but all of these are coming to America tales, and the gods who come do not belong here. And unlike the immigrants who come here and change and or both are changed by and change their experience of the United States, they find their voice and their presence and their truth here. The gods can't, because there are no stories told of Odin in America. There are no stories told of Ostara of the Dawn in America. There are no stories of Bilquis in America. These are inherited things told about events long ago and far away. But Whiskey Jack belongs here. Whiskey Jack is from here. This is his land. And this, too, is Johnny Appleseed's land. And, well, we'll continue to track that as we go forward, yeah. We're getting some talk here about the names of Odin, yes. As Gildart says, when in doubt, print more lies, stories and legends, yes. As Becca says, I love how much Gaiman praises the act of creating stories. I mean, I would hesitate to say that that is what his work in general, in aggregate, in comprehensive array is about. But I think there's an argument to be made, but it is certainly and definitively what American Gods is about. You could have taken American Gods and simply called it American Stories. You could simply have called it, if we weren't borrowing religious language for these figures, then we could have made them American Myths, American Legends. All of these titles would have worked, though perhaps they lack the immediacy of American Gods. The inclusion of Johnny Appleseed, says Elizabeth, seems really off to me. Paul Bunyan, I get, but this guy literally just planted trees. That's fascinating. Of course, I lack a perspective, a real kind of intuitive, osmotic perspective on either Johnny Appleseed or Paul Bunyan, but it seems to me that that there is a sense of Johnny Appleseed as opposed to the history of the man. And I wonder if there is a tension between those two things. I wonder if you know about John Chapman, is Johnny Appleseed a less powerful mythic figure for you? That is, of course, part of the risk of the folk hero archetype. Or is it possible that knowledge of the man actually improves your understanding of the myth, or improves your appreciation, improves the power of the myth? I'm curious about that. Yeah. As Elizabeth says, that's fine, but not mythic in a powerful sense, certainly nothing like a god. No, I think it's fair to say that Chapman, okay, let's distinguish Chapman and Johnny Appleseed, the mythic figure. I don't think that Johnny Appleseed has powers, though. Actually, I'm not sure about that, because the stories told do suggest that wherever he goes, apple trees spring up behind him, that seeds fall from his fingertips as he strolls across this great land. I mean, I think there probably is a mythic version of that, but yes, folk hero, yes. God, no. An important distinction. I think you're right. Kate says maybe it's all the school children who celebrate him. Yes. Yes. We don't necessarily fall into systems of juvenile belief in this book, which is interesting. It is almost certainly the case that there is a tooth fairy god out there. It is almost certainly the case that there is an Easter bunny god out there, as distinct from Easter herself. And of course, Santa Claus is the great unanswered question here. So yeah. All right, let's keep moving forward now that we are thoroughly uncomfortable. Shadow reintegrates, sorry, not while we are thoroughly uncomfortable, while Shadow and Wednesday are thoroughly uncomfortable about Wednesday's status as a god. Shadow immediately reintegrates himself into Lakeside. It is like he hasn't been gone. He has this beat with Marguerite Olsen when they're talking about the clunker, which is charming and lovely. And I I just want the book of Shadow's adventures in Lakeside. And we get a glimpse of that, and Shadow too gets a powerful glimpse of that in the scene with Chad Mulligan. They went across the square to Mabel's together, ordered mugs of hot chocolate. Chad said, "Hey Mike, you ever thought about a career in law enforcement?" Shadow shrugged. "Can't say that I have," he said. "Seems like there's a whole lot of things you got to know. You know, the main part of police work somewhere like this, it's just keeping your head. Something happens, somebody's screaming at you, screaming blue murder. You simply have to be able to say that you're sure that it's all a mistake. You'll just sort it out if they can step outside quietly. And you have to be able to mean it. And then you sort it out. Mostly that's when you put handcuffs on them. But yeah, you do what you can do to sort it out. Let me know if you want a job. We're hiring. You're the kind of guy we want." The irony here, of course, of Shadow Moon being the kind of guy that they want is lost on no one. But what's crucial here is that Mike Ainsel actually is the kind of guy that they want, to the degree that Mike is real. And again, we're telling stories. Shadow is telling the story of Mike so well that he is beginning still to inhabit it. It is overtaking him. Mike is becoming, within the frame of Lakeside at least, as real as Shadow Moon, maybe arguably more real than Shadow Moon. Shadow Moon would never feel comfortable sitting with Chad while he's getting his hair cut, talking about his widowed cousin, who will become relevant later, I promise you. Or crossing the street, going to Mabel's, getting mugs of hot chocolate. Shadow's discomfort around Chad when they first met was palpable and entirely understandable, given Shadow's personal experience. But Mike's completely comfortable with Chad. Mike would think about it. "Can't say that I have," he said. "Seems like there's a lot of things you got to know." That's not a Shadow response, unless Shadow is just so deep in character that it is now completely transparent to the narrative voice, too. Chad shook his head. "You know, the main part of police work somewhere like this, it's just keeping your head. Something happens, someone's screaming at you, screaming blue murder. You simply have to be able to say that you're sure it's all a mistake, and you'll just sort it out if they'll step outside quietly. And, crucially, you have to be able to mean it. You have to be able to tell a story, which is something that Shadow cannot do. Shadow isn't a storyteller. Shadow can't tell the stories necessary to turn his little acts of prestidigitation into full-on tricks. He can't sell the illusion. But as we've seen again and again and again, Chad clearly believes that Mike can sell the story. He can believe this so much that it becomes true and has a powerful effect in the world. This is one of the great distinctions between Mike Ainsel and Shadow Moon. Shadow is not a storyteller, but Mike apparently really is. And of course, we see that too with the previous reference to his prestidigitation, to the coin tricks that he's performing in the Buck Stops Here bar. That's absolutely a powerful element of Mike's presence here in Lakeside. I'm realizing that I'm running out of time and I still have, only 3 more slides. You guys will definitely make it. It's going to be just fine. A quick note here as we move on. Shadow is out walking around the town, and at one point, a small, dark cat kept pace with him beside the road. It was the color of dirt with white forepaws. He walked over to it. It did not run away. "Hey, cat," said Shadow unselfconsciously. The cat put its head on one side, looked up at him with emerald eyes. Then it hissed, not at him, but at something over on the side of the road, something he could not see. "Easy," said Shadow. The cat stalked away across the road and vanished into a field of old, unharvested corn. This almost certainly is the second appearance of Bast in the fiction. It was the color of dirt with white forepaws. When we're introduced to Bast back in chapter 8, she is described as a little brown cat. Then, most notably, when Shadow has his dream of Bast, the very vivid, powerful sex dream that he has with Bast, it begins with, "There was a girl. He had met her somewhere, and now they were walking across a bridge. It spanned a small lake in the middle of a town. The wind was ruffling the surface of the lake, making waves tipped with whitecaps, which seemed to Shadow to be tiny hands reaching for him. Down there," said the woman. That is only half relevant right now, but we will pick up the implication of that, the fullest implication of that later in the book. But it does seem as though there's a connection between Bast and Lakeside. Certainly, when Shadow dreams first of Bast, he dreams of a place that almost certainly is, let's be honest, Lakeside. Now, here she is again. And to jump the gun just a little, we're about to get Laura, which would certainly explain the cat's discomfort here. Of course, we had this brief exchange during the sex dream. He pulled it under control. He had to warn her. This is Shadow. "My wife, Laura, she will kill you." "Not me," she said. So there is already a kind of antagonism between Bast and Laura, dream Bast, cat Bast, whatever, but there is a presence here. But certainly it seems as though Shadow is still under the watchful eye of this feline goddess. Yeah, Becca says that dream is about Lakeside the whole time, right? The entirety of the Bast dream was not about Lakeside specifically, unless you're willing to open up to, a less direct metaphor. After the vision of the bridge and the lake, Shadow actually transitions back to his prison cell in the sex dream. So he kind of jumps around a little bit, but certainly that first glimpse of Lakeside. Yes. Good. Oh, this is interesting. Aaron says, "Do you think Chad really wants to ingratiate Mike into the Lakeside story, or is he just lonely?" That's a really acute question, Aaron. I think that kind of, you're putting your finger right on it there. And I think the answer is both and neither. I think that Chad likes and respects Mike and wants him to be a part of this town because you know what? It's a good town. Lakeside is a good town. Just keep repeating that until you start to believe it, you guys. Chad, I think, has been so caught up in the story of Lakeside that, of course, he wants to perpetuate it. He wants to draw Mike into it because part of the story of Lakeside is that the story is perpetuated and inclusive, that you show up and you find a home here and the town is hospitable and it draws you in. That's part of what Lakeside is. So when you are caught up in this story, as not everyone in Lakeside is, but most people are, certainly most adults are, and it would be very true of Neil Gaiman, of course, to attribute to children a kind of uncanny perspective on these things, that children are simply less likely to fall into these narrative traps than adults are. That's a very Gaiman conceit, I think, and also one that may well be, psychologically true in the real world. I think that Chad is simultaneously sincerely fond of Mike, sincerely friendly with Mike, but also completely under the sway of Lakeside. That seems to me to be utterly consistent. Yeah. Aaron says, "I would love if there was a Laura side story with her just being constantly annoyed and pestered by jealous cats." I'm into that. I could read that thing. Okay. And to Laura, we have here 2 slides left and 10 minutes to cover them. You guys, we did the thing. Here we are. He asked, "How's death?" "Hard," she said. "It just keeps going." She rested her head on his shoulder, and it almost undid him. He said, "You want to walk for a bit?" She smiled up at him, a nervous, crooked smile and a dead face. They walked out of the little graveyard and made their way back down the road toward the town, hand in hand. "Where have you been?" she asked. "Here," he said, "mostly." "Since Christmas," she said. "I kind of lost you. Sometimes I would know where you were for a few hours, for a few days. You'd be all over, then you'd fade away again." "I was in this town," he said. "Lakeside. It's a good little town." There is so much here. I guess we just have to go through it. How's death? Hard. It just keeps going. Heartbreaking immediately. But then, as I said earlier, Shadow's emotional interiority is like the North Atlantic, but when those icebergs rise, they can sink you. She rested her head on his shoulder, and it almost undid him. He said, "You want to go for a walk? You want to walk a bit?" That the threat there of complete emotional collapse, of complete emotional release, is extraordinary, is so restrained, is beautifully composed. There is so much characterization here that isn't indulgent. It isn't even necessarily explicit. It's just evident. It's just there. She rested her head on his shoulder, and it almost undid him. She smiled up at him, a nervous, crooked smile in a dead face. They walked out of the little graveyard and made their way back down the road toward the town, hand in hand. And here we see that Laura has been, in a sense, tracking. Even Laura can't find Shadow when he's in Lakeside. This presumably plays into the notion of Lakeside as a secure refuge for Shadow. This is where he goes where he cannot be seen. This is off the board, off the map, whatever it is that Wednesday has described Lakeside as being. Though, of course, we circle back around to Lakeside. It's a good little town. That line in Shadow's mouth, I think, completely communicates his desperate discomfort at this point. He is perilously close to being utterly lost. He is perilously close to cracking. But he seeks refuge in this moment in the story of Lakeside again. And that's indicative, I think, because it's indicative of the power of the story, but also of the safe allure of Mike Ainsel. Shadow can retreat from Laura and Robbie and Wednesday and hurt and pain and angst and prison and keeping his head down and his Beth that he never got. All of these things, he can retreat from them into the warm embrace of Lakeside and into the presence of Mike Ainsel himself. Oh, Aaron's connecting "it's a good town" with "it's a magical place," the phrase that is used to describe Tahiti in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. That's very good. Yes. Elizabeth says the two of them walking together in the snow tugs at my heartstrings. So simple. I completely agree. And Aaron says that line, a nervous, crooked smile and a dead face, that would sucker me in instantly. Yeah. Yes, good. Gildart says Shadow is lost, but he is also panicking. He must be thinking, what the hell is this? I'm not sure about that. I would have expected the same thing, honestly, but I think that what we get instead, well, actually, you know what? That is a great segue that we can use to throw to the next thing. What is up with Shadow? Why is he not panicking? Is it because he's not really alive? "You're not dead," she said, "but I'm not sure that you're alive either. Not really." This isn't the way this conversation goes, thought Shadow. This isn't the way anything goes. "I love you," she said dispassionately. "You're my puppy. But when you're really dead, you get to see things clearer. It's like there isn't anyone there, you know? You're like this big, solid, man-shaped hole in the world." She frowned. "Even when we were together, I loved being with you because you adored me and you would do anything for me, but sometimes I'd go into a room and I wouldn't think there was anybody in there. And I'd turn the light on, or I'd turn the light off. And I'd realize that you were in there, sitting on your own, not reading, not watching TV, not doing anything." She hugged him then, as if to take the sting from her words. And she said, "The best thing about Robbie was that he was somebody. He was a jerk sometimes, and he could be a joke, but he loved to have mirrors around when we and he loved to have mirrors around when we made love so he could watch himself fucking me, but he was alive, puppy. He wanted things. He filled the space." She stopped, looked up at him, tipped her head a little to one side. "I'm sorry. Did I hurt your feelings?" He did not trust his voice not to betray him, so he simply shook his head. "Good," she said. "It's good." This, as Elizabeth says in the YouTube chat here, is the closest we've gotten to show Laura. I agree with that. I love this version of Laura possibly more than any other version of Laura. Let me refine that, I suppose. I love this scene better than I love almost anything that we got in the show about Laura. And Laura in the show is magnificent, but this is fantastic. Let's begin with, you're not dead, but I'm not sure that you're alive either. Not really. I mean, this is setting up our dichotomy. This is our functional opposition here. And not just within this scene, not just within the sequence, not just within this relationship. This is so much more powerful than that, because in a sense, dead and alive speaks to mortal and immortal. This is echoing the fundamental juxtaposition at the heart of American Gods. But then we get this odd break into Shadow's POV, and we do this so rarely that it jumps out at me every time that we do it. This isn't the way this conversation goes, thought Shadow. This isn't the way anything goes. Is he afflicted by absurdity here? Is he simply baffled and confused and out of his depth and out of his element and unable to process what is happening to him? This isn't the way this conversation goes. This isn't the way anything goes, being the kind of semantic equivalent of this is insane here. This isn't the way this conversation goes. This isn't the way anything goes. That there is something fundamentally wrong with this version of him and Laura. Some fundamental disconnection there. I love you, she said dispassionately. You're my puppy. Okay, let's concede both of those things. The court will stipulate you love him and he is your puppy. But when you're really dead, you get to see things clearer. It's like there isn't anyone there. You know, you're like this big, solid, man-shaped hole in the world. That Shadow, and of course, we should be very aware of his name as we're reading this, is almost the absence of a person. Do we believe this account of Shadow? And I ask that not just because this is Laura, an avowed unreliable narrator, but also because she kind of contradicts herself here too. When you're really dead, you get to see things clearer. And then she says, even when we were together, I loved being with you because you adore me and you would do anything for me, but sometimes I'd go into a room and I wouldn't think there was anyone in there. You'd just be sitting there, not reading, not watching TV, just present. Just, or I guess not present, just occupying space, but no more than that. Was Laura aware of that before she died? And then she equates it with Robbie. The best thing about Robbie was that he was somebody. He was a jerk sometimes and he could be a joke, but he wanted things. He filled the space. Is that what drew Laura to Robbie? Or is this part of a new perspective that she has gained? Yeah. Aaron says in the YouTube chat, I totally believe this account. Yes. Okay. Gildart says, I feel like she is making him feel badly, scaring him when he is actually the one who was hurt by her, which I think is completely fair. Yeah. Yeah, good. Puppy my foot, says Gildart's Winters. Puppy my foot, but I do believe that she's in the right in her own mind. Yes. But here's the thing. It is also possible that Shadow exists and Laura couldn't see him. Here we're echoing two ideas from earlier in the chapter, and this is, I think, the kind of thing that Gaiman takes a great deal of delight in doing, because we get two ideas. We get the one that sometimes Laura literally couldn't see Shadow. And as we discussed earlier, seeing is more than witnessing, more than experiencing. It is about apprehending. It is about perceiving in a fundamental way. It is about recognizing the uniquity of you. I see you is a powerful statement about the interaction of two people. And Laura, sometimes explicitly, couldn't see Shadow. She could apparently see Robbie, but Robbie also filled his space. Robbie expanded in exactly the same way as we just discussed stories expand. If the truth isn't big enough, tell the legend. If the legend isn't big enough, tell a bigger legend. Tell a bigger myth. Create a god. Why not? But Shadow can't tell stories. That's not who he is. So Robbie's there filling all the space and telling all the stories and being this energetic figure, and Shadow is not. And Laura, as most people are, is drawn to the story, compelled by the story. She's getting The Legend of Robbie. And God knows, I'm sure she got The Legend of Robbie over and over and over again. He seems like the kind of guy who would tell his own legend from time to time. Yeah. Aaron says, I think this is Laura realizing views that she never would have admitted to herself in life. Becca says, the first thing to go is your frontal lobe. Laura has lost her filter. No, I think that's entirely possible. I think it's entirely possible that she is telling the literal truth here. But within the span of, 2 paragraphs, we are referencing specific ideas which came up in very powerful contexts earlier in the chapter. This idea of seeing and being known and of being more than, this existential question, as Wednesday describes it, and this idea of expansion. We get both of those things echoed right here, which makes me wonder to what degree. Okay, 2 possibilities beyond okay, 3 possibilities. The first, Laura is literally telling the truth. Absolutely valid, absolutely, compatible with the read of the text. I'm there with you. The second possibility is that Shadow's absence of story, Shadow's absence of narrative means that he is hard to see, means that he is difficult to perceive, that he's capable of sitting in a quiet room and all but disappearing, which is very suggestive of his appeal to Wednesday. That may well be what makes Shadow so interesting in the first place. Third alternative, Laura's awful. And okay, that's an exaggeration. Laura's definitely not awful. But Laura is swayed by the story in exactly the way that people are swayed by stories. The bigger story wins. Even if the bigger story isn't as good or isn't as true or isn't as pure, the bigger story wins and the quiet truth goes overlooked. It's a third possible interpretation here. We will, of course, as we're told right at the end here, nothing's finished yet. Laura's going to go south, and she's going to, we'll find out what she does in the interludes next week. There's a nice joke there, if you haven't read ahead yet. But we will find out what happens with Laura. But as they say explicitly, nothing is finished yet. We're going to circle back around to this. It all comes round again, and it will continue to come around next week. Next week, we won't be holding the session on Tuesday because Tuesday is the 4th of July, and I think that a lot of our listeners will have other plans on that day. I did think about it. It did strike me as somewhat appropriate that there's a kind of apposite functionality to discussing American Gods on the 4th of July, but also I would quite like to just have a beer and watch some fireworks. So I think I'll probably do that instead, you guys. So what we're going to do next week is move this live session to Friday, July 7th, 2017, 6 p.m. Eastern. We're going to cover all 3 interludes, which are not long at all, and then chapter 13, which gives us a major turning point in the book. This is the act structure of American Gods is a little shaky. This is kind of our midpoint. We do have a very elongated first act in American Gods, which kind of throws off the structure a little bit, but we're basically about to hit our midpoint in the 3-act structure of American Gods, and it's going to happen next week. Do not miss it. That will do it. I can't believe I got through all of those slides in the requisite time. I know that we skimmed a little here. We kind of we moved swiftly through some things that I would like to have discussed a little more, but this is a long book and it's not getting any shorter, you guys. It's really not. That will do it. Thank you so much for joining me. The podcast version, of course, will be available very soon, very shortly here. I'm scrolling back. There's horrible lag in the YouTube chat tonight. I apologize that I haven't been keeping up as well as I should with your conversation, but we are minutes apart now. I am minutes in the future from you and you don't even know it. It's a terrible thing. That is why I'm thinking about alternate broadcast platforms. As I said, if you have any suggestions or personal experience, please email me, pointnorthmedia@gmail.com. Everything that I do at Point North Media is thanks to you, the Patreon supporters of Point North Media. If you have $1 a month or perhaps even more, head on over to patreon.com/pointnorthmedia to pledge your support. That will do it for this week. You guys, thank you so much for joining me. I will talk to you all again soon. Until then, take care.